What must I do to have everlasting life? This is the question asked by the young rich man from Jesus Christ. And there are several people mentioned in the scriptures who ask the same question. The young lawyer asked the same question, what must I do to have everlasting life? The apostles were asking that question. And so Pope John Paul II gave the story of the young rich man as the main topic of his encyclical Veritatis Splendor, because this question is of the utmost importance for each one of us, in that we must learn the answer of Jesus Christ to our question, what must we do to have everlasting life? Now, if you will notice, the question is, what must I do? Not so much what I must believe. Because what we must do and what we must believe are correlated to one another, meaning to say, what we believe will be independent on what and how much we have obeyed Christ's command. The more we do what we must do to have everlasting life, the more we will understand what the things we must believe to have everlasting life. And so Christ, in the occasion when the young rich man went to him, gave an answer. But that answer was just one part of the gospel. Meaning to say, the answer that Jesus Christ gives each one of us is found in all the writings of the Gospels that are read to us. What we must do are all found in the Gospel given by us by Jesus Christ. However, the Gospel is not arranged in such a way that the commands that we must do are in proper order. When Jesus Christ taught us the commands that we must do to have everlasting life, He arranged it properly from the easiest to the most difficult. However, these commands are not found in scriptures in the proper order. They are all jumbled up, as you may say. And the gospel writers, the evangelists, precisely did this so that those who are not really sincere in knowing how to attain everlasting life, or those who are wanted to know the teaching of the gospel simply for commercial purposes, may not know exactly how it is done. And so Holy Mother of the Church arranged it properly, arranged the gospel in such a way that the gospels from Advent up to Christ the King is arranged in such a way that we may know what we must do starting from Advent, which is the easiest thing that we must do, and ending up before Christ the King, which are the most difficult thing that we must do. So we are going to ask Christ the same question, what must I do to have everlasting life? And in every Sunday Gospels, beginning from the first Sunday of Advent up to Christ the King, we shall try to find out what is the answer of Jesus Christ. Christ, of course, had given us the answer in the Gospels, and it is very clear in the Gospels. An ordinary man can understand the words of the Gospel, whether it is in Latin or in English. However, the interpretation of the Gospel is of the utmost importance. No one has the right to interpret the gospel on his own. No human being, no theologian, no priest, no bishop, no cardinal, not even the Holy Father can interpret the gospel. Why? Because the gospels are the words of Christ. They are the words of God, and only God knows the meaning of what He said. And so when Christ was preaching the gospel, He was also interpreting the words of the gospel. Except the evangelists could not write it down, it was difficult enough for the evangelists to write down the commandments of Jesus Christ on what we must do to have everlasting life. To interpret the gospel and write it down, St. John the Evangelist said, would have to contain all the libraries of the world, and still those libraries will not be able to contain all the interpretation that Christ has given. And so the evangelists wrote down the commandments of Christ on what we must do, but they did not have time or probably the paper in order to write down the correct interpretation which Christ Himself has given. So keep this in mind, that the interpretation of the words of Christ in the gospel were given by Christ Himself, but the evangelists were not able to write it down. However, Christ and the apostles have told the first Christian communities the interpretation of what we must do to have everlasting life. And this is what you call in the Catholic Church the verbal interpretation or tradition of the Catholic Church. Later on, the bishops of the Christian communities had time to write down the interpretations that Christ gave. And therefore, these holy bishops, who now are referred to as the fathers of the church, had written down every word that Christ had uttered in scriptures. They are all now written down by the fathers of the church and further elaborated by the doctors of the church. And in the Catholic Church, they are referred to as the official interpreter of the words of Christ. Therefore, there are two things that we must do. First, we must know the words of Christ and what we must do to have everlasting life. And then, secondly, we must know the interpretation that Christ gave. Christ Himself gave it, but written down by the fathers of the church and elaborated by the doctors of the church. And therefore, to the question, what must I do to have everlasting life? We must first know the words of the gospel. Secondly, the interpretation of the fathers of the church. Then, thirdly, if you will notice, Jesus Christ, when He was preaching to the chosen people, told them what they must do to have everlasting life, and also explained to them the interpretation of how they can attain everlasting life. But in spite of the fact that Jesus Christ was the best teacher and the best preacher during that time, the Jews could not understand Him. They already have the two elements necessary to learn what they must do to have everlasting life, and yet they could not understand and they never learn what they must do to have everlasting life. What was the matter? What was wrong with them? They did not have humility. They were proud. And Christ will never teach a proud person on how to go to heaven. That's the reason precisely why in one of the Gospels, Christ commanded us to learn from Him. What must we do to have everlasting life? Christ said, "Learn from me, for I am meek and humble of heart." And so the third element that we must have to be able to learn how to have everlasting life is humility. There, we have the three elements necessary that we must do to learn from Christ what we must do to have everlasting life. First, we must know the words of Christ taken from the Sunday Gospels. Secondly, we must know the interpretation as taken from the fathers and the doctors of the church, which are not found in sacred scripture. And thirdly, we must know and we must become humble. The spiritual writers of the Catholic Church have described that there are 12 degrees of humility. If you have the first degree of humility, you will understand the words of Christ in some degree. But the higher you go into the degrees of humility, the more you will understand the teachings of Christ, the more you will understand the interpretations, and therefore the greater is your possibility of precisely attaining everlasting life. And so this is the purpose of this series of talks entitled, "What Must I Do to Have Everlasting Life?" And every talk and every Sunday we will try to find out what is the answer of Jesus Christ as interpreted by the fathers and the doctors of the church, and hopefully we are humble enough to understand what Christ said and what the fathers and the doctors of the church had explained.